I feel that nuclear power has been and will continue to be a very important source of electricity in this country. And it's one that's American design, based on an American resource, uranium. And in this day and age, when energy is at a premium and electricity is so much an important part of our life, we can't afford to throw away or waste any kind of energy source. That means we've got to use conservation whenever possible, and we've got to develop every energy resource we can. This would give the freedom of choice to everybody in the country to select among the sources available what energy mix they will want. And the sources available include, of course, coal, nuclear power, other fossil fuels like oil and gas, wind power, solar power, other things like hydroelectric that could be developed to a greater degree.
We feel that from mine and mill to the time it's buried, the fuel emits dangerous amounts of radiation, and that another reason we think of is the possibility of an accident occurring at the reactor site or along the road. And there have been near meltdowns in the past where certain amounts of the fuel melted down in the reactor. It was controlled, however, and so that the amount of release wasn't as great as a real meltdown. If, in the event of a meltdown, there were a release, it depends upon where the reactor is at and which way the wind's blowing over the period of time during the release. And we're basically downwind from 3 reactors at Dresden, and they could cause the death of tens of thousands of people. And if there was a northerly coming from the Zion nuclear power station, there would be destruction of not only tens of thousands, but some of the best real estate in the country. Ironically, it's an area where a lot of rich people live, and they'd be catching it too.
Uranium is an American resource. It's something that America has as much of as OPEC has oil, something that we can't afford not to develop. Uranium, of course, is the fuel for nuclear power plants, and the whole technology is an American technology. The second reason would be that nuclear power plants are actually the least environmentally impacting source of electricity we have, except for hydroelectric dams, which can be built at places where water falls off of a higher level to a lower level, but in places like Illinois, where it's pretty much flat, we don't get much opportunity for that. But of the types of fuel that you could burn to make electricity, uranium or nuclear power would be the least impact on the environment of all of them. And finally, in our utility, we found that nuclear power costs us less to generate than any other form that we've got. The second best from a cost standpoint is coal, and our nuclear plants generate power for about half the cost of our coal plants.
We're talking about solar power and conservation. We waste an awful lot of electricity and energy, and nuclear power appeared to be a cornucopia when they started it, and now it's pretty much drying up. They were talking in 1972, President Nixon said that there would be 1,000 nuclear power plants by the end of the century. Now it looks like at best they'll have 150. And we're going to try to eliminate all of them before the end of the century and have the new century the beginning of the solar age. It means, however, that we have to start seeing that the investments are put into solar power and conservation now and shifted away from the nuclear industry, which tends to concentrate the wealth in the hands of a few executives and investors.
This nation runs on power. Nuclear power now supplies about 4% of all our energy needs. Some have said that if we don't use nuclear power, the U.S. will have to rely too much on coal, which in turn could hurt the environment. Former Assistant Secretary of Energy George E. Cunningham said, "We can survive without nuclear energy, but we cannot have a healthy, growing economy and an improved standard of living for those who need it. The Reagan administration is a strong supporter of nuclear power. He has lifted the ban on reprocessing spent fuel rods from uranium into plutonium. Former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt said in answering anti-nuclear groups, "Nobody should pretend that mankind can return to nuclear innocence." Still, all is not well with the industry. This was shown when Robert Slazy, vice president of the Atomic Industrial Forum, stated one of the classic understatements of our times when he said, "The nuclear industry has had its problems lately, hasn't it?" Since 3 Mile Island, a lot of concern has been given to nuclear power, especially in the area of safety. What is the national position on nuclear energy? Also, do we really need nuclear energy to satisfy our nation's thirst for energy? This documentary will try and take a look at the nuclear issue, both pro and con, to determine if nuclear energy is truly needed for our energy security. The reason that we have nuclear power is that there is no other major source of power ready to produce large amounts of energy now. Although fossil fuels like oil and natural gas are now in large supply, their supplies are limited. It is only a matter of time until the supplies run out. Unless major new sources are found, natural gas could be used up within the decade. Also, U.S. resources of conventional oil will be seriously depleted by the year 2000. Fossil fuels are finite. When a barrel of oil is burned, it is gone forever. Coal is one bright spot in the overall energy picture, yet rapid expansion of facilities for coal transport is difficult. Also, the problem of pollution is a hard one to solve. To get to much of the coal reserves, strip mining must be used. This will tear up a lot of good land and possibly leave it unusable for the future. There is no quick fix. No real help can be expected from shale oil, oil from coal, or geothermal energy until at least 1990, if then. The renewables do not appear to be of much help either, since solar, ocean thermal energy, and wind power won't play a big part until the year 2000. This makes the energy problem even more troubling. The U.S. is one of the richest energy nations on Earth. We have the largest supply of coal. Although the U.S. imports oil, the U.S. is still the third largest oil producer. We are self-sufficient in natural gas. We also have the largest nuclear output of any nation on Earth. To give you an idea of how important nuclear power is to the world, look how many plants there are. In the U.S. alone, 70 plants are online, 85 under construction, and 19 more are under order. Nuclear power produces over 80% of the power in Vermont, 60% in Maine, and 50% of the energy needed in the states of Nebraska and Connecticut. While here at home in Illinois, it supplies about 45% of our needs. To show how our energy needs have changed, let's look at the energy use of the U.S. between the years 1970 and the year 2000. Back in 1970, the oil that we imported was cheap and plentiful. All oil imports accounted for a cost of only $3 billion out of a total energy uses of 67 quads, that is billions of BTUs, British thermal units. Both domestic and imported oil took care of about 45% of our energy needs. While coal and natural gas supplied 19% and 32% of our energy needs respectively. In 1970, nuclear power was only starting to be used commercially, thus it supplied about 1% of our energy. Things changed in 1980 as the Arabs used their oil weapon for the first time. Our imported oil bill, which was only $3 billion in 1970, was now over $60 billion. Nuclear power had become into wide use, with nuclear supplying about 4% of our needs. But more importantly, nuclear now produced 14% of our electricity in this country. Oil still made up the biggest part of our overall energy picture, with oil supplying 46% of our energy. The use of coal rose to over 20%, while natural gas declined due to decreased stocks to 26% of the energy use. In 1990, our energy needs will change even more. Oil imports will fall off. Also, domestic production through deregulation will rise, and conservation will help keep the use down. Yet even with conservation, the total amount of energy for the year 1990 will be 89 quads. Oil will only account for 35% of our energy. Coal will become one of the dominant energy sources due to the availability of it. It won't take over the energy leadership, but it will come close with supplying 30% of the energy. Natural gas will become even less important in 1990, supplying only 22% of the energy. Nuclear energy expected to become even more used, with nuclear power supplying over 9% of our total energy, with even more of a percentage of electricity. Finally, by the year 2000, the economy could shift from oil and natural gas to coal, nuclear power, and synthetic forms of energy. Coal will be the primary resource for energy, while nuclear will probably be the major source of electricity. The total energy uses could be as high as 108 quads. Coal will likely supply 32% of the energy. Imported and domestic oil will supply 31%, thus losing its leadership in energy supply. The use of natural gas will also fall to only 16% of our total amount of energy used. The nuclear energy will most likely take care of 10% of our energy needs. The bright spot is that sources like solar, wind will finally play a big role in the amount of energy produced. By the year 2000, sources will produce more energy than nuclear energy. The only problem is that, in the meantime, no sources are ready for immediate use. So it seems that nuclear energy will play a big role in the future energy history of our nation. Still, that does not mean we should go ahead with it automatically. There are advantages and disadvantages for nuclear power. Let's take a look at them now. One of the big advantages of nuclear power is that it is cheap. The uranium pellets that a plant runs on are the size of a thimble, costs only $7, but has the energy of 3 barrels of oil, or 1 ton of coal. Thus, a nuclear power plant, once operating, can run at about half the cost of an oil plant. ComEd states that through the use of nuclear reactors that they have saved $366 million. With the use of recycling plants, the amount of material needed for fission could last for hundreds of years. The nuclear industry states that no one has ever been killed from nuclear energy. They also look to the safety measures in a plant to prove that statement. It takes over 10 years to build a plant. This time is needed to see if a plant is safe, and if not, what needs to be done to make it so. To protect the public against radiation, the fuel core, where the enriched U-235 is, there is a reactor vessel to protect the core. In addition to that, there is a steel containment building outside of that. Finally, outside of all the others, there is a shield building made out of reinforced concrete over 3 feet thick to protect the public. Another problem would be to protect the plant from those who might want to damage it. Each plant has its own security force and a network inside the plant to find anyone who might want to damage it. Another point that the nuclear industry states is that according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, power plants release only about 0.15% of all the radiation a person gets in 1 year. Even with the assurances from the atomic industry, many people are against nuclear power. One of the biggest concerns of the anti-nuclear groups is that the fact that a number of these plants are located near major metropolitan centers. If something should happen to just one of these plants, the effects would be terrible. Every day, nuclear power plants release very small amounts of radiation. Yet the worst problem is that what to do with the waste that is from the reactor. Opponents of nuclear power state the government doesn't know what wants to be done with this deadly material. Some of the lower-level radiation travels the roads to different waste dumps every day. They claim the industry is no closer to protecting the public against nuclear waste today than it was at the inception of the commercial nuclear program. They also point to the fact that the cheapest nuclear power plant now costs $3.5 billion. Another fear of the opponents of the industry is that nuclear power plants comes the possibility of proliferation of nuclear weapons. So there is a difference in opinion in the nuclear debate. First of all, before we look at 3 Mile Island, let's take a look at a nuclear power plant to see how it is run, and then what did indeed happen at 3 Mile Island. The basics of a plant is simple. The core will heat up the water will be turned into steam, the steam will run a turbine, the turbine will run the generator to get the electricity. Let me show you in more detail just how this is done. As I stated before, water is pumped into the reactor vessel. This water contacts the core will heat up the water. Pumps will take the hot water out of the vessel. By the way, the water is pressurized or else there would be no way the water could stand the high temperature. Next, the water will be turned into a gas. This gas is in the form of steam. The steam will run the turbines and produce the electricity. Then the steam will be at the condensation point. The water, steam, will flow against the cool pipes in the condenser. The cooled water will be taken through the tertiary loop to cool down enough to be put back in the regular water systems if need be. This is done by taking the water, pumping it up 20 feet into the cooling tower. It is then allowed to fall. Some of it evaporates as it falls. This transfers the heat into the air. As the heated air rises, this causes more air to be drawn into the bottom of the tower. The water reaches the bottom and is at 65 degrees. This will then be pumped out into a pond on site of the plant where it can cool even more before being put into the plant. When people think of the problems of nuclear power, they almost always think of 3 Mile Island. At TMI, this nation realized what could go wrong with a nuclear power plant. Ultimately, this has had the most devastating effect on the industry as a whole. What happened at 3 Mile Island? Could it happen again? Also, what are the major changes in the industry as a result of the accident? First of all, what did happen at 3 Mile Island? According to the President's Commission on the Accident at 3 Mile Island, the accident began at 4 a.m. on March 28, 1979. There was a failure in the system. The secondary loop had no water in it. This caused the primary loop to heat up. The backup pump started in, and for some unexplained reason they were turned off. This was the worst thing they could have done. The temperature in the reactor then jumped to over 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. With the temperature that high, the zirconium began to melt away from the rods. The fuel rods then began to fall apart. This caused the release of hydrogen gas and other radioactive material into the water. This material was carried through the water into the ruptured quench tank, and then into the containment building. The hydrogen gas in the containment building exploded. But by the evening of the 28th, the crisis was about over. The plant was stable, and the core was starting to cool down. The effect of the people who lived within the 50-mile radius of the plant received only about 2,000 person rems of radiation. This is compared to the 240,000 person rems a normal person gets during a year from background radiation. Thus, the Commission concluded that on the basis of present scientific knowledge, the radiation doses received by general population as a result of exposure to the radioactivity during the accident were so small that there will be no detectable additional causes of cancer, developmental abnormalities, or genetic ill health as a consequence of the accident at 3 Mile Island. After 3 Mile Island, the industry has been heavily regulated. This has drawn out the time it has taken to get a plant from drawing board to reality. Others called for better training of operators of nuclear power plants, adding an additional technical advisor for each shift at the plant. These people would be there to monitor safety systems and to help operators interpret the conditions in the plant, making operators be able to handle many other things going on wrong at the same time, and finally, improving the warnings at the plant. This would help the operators foresee what is going wrong. All these regulations don't mean that another TMI couldn't happen again, but at least it makes the plant safer. One of the biggest changes since 3 Mile Island accident has been that the orders for plants have fallen to nothing. Also, plants that were planned have been scrapped. So the industry has been hurt by 3 Mile Island. But now it is up to the time to decide whether the nuclear industry can come out of it, or will it die. Right now, there are 8 operating nuclear power plants in Illinois. They are at Morris, where 3 reactors are in operation. 2 others are at Zion. Another 2 reactors are at the Quad City complex at Cordova. Finally, there is 1 reactor in operation at LaSalle, with another to come in operation soon. The problem with these plants is that they are near major urban centers. For example, the reactors at Zion is 50 miles away from not only Milwaukee, but also Chicago. Even at 10 miles away, over 240,000 people are near a reactor. The reactors at Morris could also pose a threat. If sizable amounts of radiation would escape from one of these plants, the cloud would most likely pass over Chicago. At 3 Mile Island, a cloud of radiation escaped from the plant. But according to the commission that investigated the accident, the total radiation received from the people around the plant was about 2 rem. The commission concluded that the radiation received by the people around the plant was not enough to cause any new cases of cancer or any other side effects of radiation.
There was no danger from 3 Mile Island. It was shown by tests and studies done after the accident. It was probably one of the most thoroughly studied events that's ever occurred. there was financial danger, which awakened a lot of people in the utility business, because here was a plant that was being counted upon by the utility. In fact, they had a lot of money invested in it, and it was producing power very cheaply for them. And all of a sudden, this plant's out of service, not just for a month or a year, but for several years. So not only do they have this big investment sitting there not doing anything for them, but they've got to go buy that power that it would be generating from a neighboring utility, and the cost of that is a lot higher than the cost would have been if 3 Mile Island were generating that power. So this financial risk has been realized, and it really set the utility industry on its ear.
If they'd been living up to the regulations at the time, if they hadn't been falsifying material, that probably wouldn't have happened. It's a matter of getting honest people in there, into the industries. And really, to be honest, it doesn't work. So you're just talking about people who are kind of pipe dreaming.
Ultimately, we've even found that even if the core melts, which is something that the meltdown is feared by the public because engineers originally got this going. It's the engineers' fault. When they originally designed nuclear reactors, somebody said, well, how well should we design these things? What should be the cutoff point? And the engineering cutoff point was that we should not have a meltdown. And it wasn't that a meltdown would be the end of the world, it was just that that was the engineering cutoff. They decided that was the place they wanted to stop, so the plant would definitely not have a meltdown. So they engineered the plant with all these safety systems and whatever to keep the thing from ever melting. And nobody ever asked the question, well, what if you have one anyway? What would happen? Until an analysis that we did for Zion, precisely because of its location near a metropolitan area, that went through and calculated what would happen if the core melted. And we didn't even bother saying, well, how would it melt? We said, let's assume it does. And we've got experts in plastic fluid flow and concrete ablation and water material interaction to go through and do these calculations. And it turns out that a meltdown would be contained in the containment in all but about 1% of the cases. So you could have 100 meltdowns, and only one of them would result in any significant release of radioactivity at all to the environment.
Tens of thousands of people would die immediately, and then thousands others by cancer afterwards. And it really depends upon the general wind direction and proximity of the plant to large population areas. Zion would be pretty bad if there was a northerly. In winter, a good gust would bring down the material into the environment. The area around the Byron plants, which are under construction near Rockford, the prevailing winds would wipe out tens of thousands of people right there and make an area uninhabitable for centuries.
Both the opponents and advocates realize that the major problem with nuclear energy is in the disposal of waste. The recycling plants take the spent fuel rods and through a chemical process separate the usable uranium and plutonium. This can be used to make more fuel rods to supply nuclear reactors. The advantage of this is that the amount of material for reactors is now increased by over 50 times. Another use for this recycled plutonium is for breeder reactors. Right now, there is no commercial breeder reactor in the U.S. The concern with the use of breeders and recycling plants is that they produce plutonium. Only a few pounds of this element, and one has enough to make a nice-sized bomb. Critics of this argument state that it's truly harder than it seems to put together such a nuclear device. Still, there are problems with security at these plants. For example, the government ran a series of mock attacks on their nuclear bomb plants, and many failed these tests. One plant in Florida failed a series of tests so badly that it was concluded that the plant had less than a 1% chance of defending against a terrorist attack. At another plant, the guard force responded to a mock attack over 16 minutes after the terrorists had already escaped with enough material in the form of plutonium to make at least one bomb. Eventually, this material has to be taken care of. Right now, with no reprocessing plants in sight, the industry is faced with a dilemma. That is, what in the world do you do with the stuff? The plants now keep the material. They keep it in huge water-filled containers that are able to hold large but limited quantities of nuclear waste. Other low-level radioactive material is put in casks and buried. These casks will stay buried until a way is found to protect the public from it. As it is now, some casks have been buried in areas that it could get into the drinking water. Another way of disposal in the past was practiced by the government. They put the low-level water in 55-gallon drums and threw them into the ocean. This was stopped soon after it began, but that doesn't make the point any less clear. It is stupid to dump the radioactive material where it can do harm to the environment. The future of nuclear power rests on that point alone. Can the industry find an acceptable way of disposing of its waste and not hurt the world around us? There is a sign of hope. One light at the end of this tunnel. This light is known as the salt dome. The area in which salt domes are appearing, they appear to be stable geologically. They do not have groundwater moving through it that could carry off radioactive material. If there were any water in the salt domes, the salt would have been washed away a long time ago. Also, if the salt would crack by the heat of the radioactive material, they would seal the crack by itself. This is a characteristic not found in granite or volcanic rock formations. According to physicist Neil Carter of the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, he stated, "We've concluded that salt domes are fully capable of containing radioactivity. With all the good news with the salt domes, there is one danger. That is, what about in the future when all the records of these have been lost on these radioactive crypts? People could stumble into the dome accidentally. This could mean that a nuclear priesthood must have to be formed to keep track of all buried materials." During the upcoming years, with limited choices for possible energy sources, this nation cannot refuse to look at nuclear power. Still, this does not mean we should turn our heads away from the dangers associated with nuclear power, these being the problems with waste and the problems with the plants themselves. This needs to be done so that another 3-mile island will not again threaten the populace around a nuclear plant. Even with the dangers involved with the nuclear process, regulation should be lessened so it takes less time to get a plant in operation. Without nuclear power, this nation would be forced to do one of two things: make do with less, or have to buy expensive Arab oil. So while nuclear power is doing the job of supplying electricity for the nation, we need to reevaluate what role nuclear power should play in our overall energy condition until sources like solar, wind power, and geothermal can step in and replace it or lessen its role.
Switches. The computer then automatically tracks the rig. Presently, the system is still in the experimental stage. Again, Dave Anderson.
Basically, what the research program we're conducting now is essentially flight testing this system to determine how well it tracks the radar target over the water. We will fly the helicopter offshore and locate a suitable radar target over water, which is normally a large ship, and that simulates basically an oil rig, which we don't have any in the location here. And what we have is an HP 9845 computer on board, which is collecting all the data from the radar, which we use for later evaluation as to the performance of the auto tracking capability.
The offshore radar computer, building on today's technology to improve helicopter to oil rig flights in the future.